folks. We're doing a Dagwood reads today. We are gonna. It's probably gonna be a pretty short one. I did just look at the chapters or whatever. This is gonna be a pretty short one, but that's okay. I'm a little tired today, anyhow. I just got done in doing the studio stuff. So let's just get after it. Okay. So we are in first, the importance of being earnest, the life of actor Jim Varney. We are in chapter 16. This is called Hobo Stoop. Being a bachelor much of his life, Jim learned by necessity to cook for himself. Chili was one of his best dishes, and he seemed to prefer one pot meals, which were often the easiest to prepare. One of his specialties was what he called hobo soup, or hobo stew. The steps were simple. He said, just throw the contents of your refrigerator into one pot. He admitted the only problem with the dish was the fact that you could never accurately recreate it. Jim sometimes mentioned how his father had been a hobo of sorts for a bit. A family story went that in the summer of 1934, Big Jim and his brother-in-law Everett caught a train from Lexington and eventually made it down to Texas in a boxcar. What kind of work they were looking for is not known. A letter Jim wrote to his parents 50 years after the episode makes reference to the trip. Yesterday I did the United Way kickoff in Amarillo, Texas, and Pappy, it was held in the old Santa Fe train yard. Just think, it was the first time since 1930s that a Jim Varney was in the Amarillo yard, and I didn't have to whip even one railroad bull. Jim welcomed the chance to display his cooking skills when he made an appearance in 1987 on Florence Henderson's Country Kitchen cooking show on the Nashville Network. The dish he had demonstrated was curry pepper steak. Part of the dish consisted of a mixture of water, onions, and cornstarch for a gravy. Henderson and Jim shared a laugh with the studio audience when the ingredients failed to thicken and looked more like onion slices floating in milky water. Things did not go much better during the commercial break. Evidently, extra cornstarch was added, but it ended up being too much. When mentioning the dish after returning from the commercial, Jim explained it's always best to use a little less than a half a pound of cornstarch for 4 people. He continued, you have to slice the gravy when you do it. When Jim and Henderson discussed their upbringings, Jim revealed that he had researched her biography and found that they had a Kentucky connection. Henderson had lived for a short time in Owensboro. Jim joked that he was a Hill William from Lexington. Again, this was the term he loved to use in describing a certain upper class of Southern hillbilly. A Hill William, for example, enjoyed the luxury of indoor plumbing. Although he finished the steak dish, he was never shown. The steak dish was never shown to the TV audience. Henderson did think enough of it to include it in her cookbook for the show. A little cooking, a little talking, and a whole lot of fun. Meanwhile, as thin as Jim stayed, you could never tell by looking at him how much he loved to eat. Nothing pleased him more than a plate full of Southern food and breakfasts of biscuits and gravy. Perhaps Jim's biggest weakness was candy, especially the homemade kind. Growing up, his mother always had a dessert prepared following supper. From her, he learned to make such favorites as chocolate fudge and cream candy. His sister Sandy remembers visiting the set of Ernest Scared Stupid and noticed a sign in Jim's dressing room warning people to stay away from Mr. Varney's candy bowl. Fortunately, he could gorge himself on all the sweets he wanted without gaining a pound. What? What? I'm reading a book. Jim's father always said his son ate like a dog, meaning that he ate a lot when he was hungry, but little less other times. Even journalists would note in their articles the way Jim attacked a plate of food during interviews. When visiting his family back home, Jim could easily put down a couple of plates of food and 2 or 3 desserts. When he had the time, he ate healthy, but the stretches on the road took a toll on his diet and he resorted to starches and sweets. Unfortunately, candy wasn't Jim's only unhealthy habit. Reporters often wrote about how he chain smoked. He laughed off one interviewer's comment by joking, "Nah, I'm not a chain smoker. They're real hard to light, and if you have to carry that big torch." The truth was, very little time would pass between him putting out one cigarette and lighting up the next. All right, that was the end of chapter 16. On chapter 17. All right, it's called Handgun Wedding. Chapter 17. Jane Hale, who went by Janie, was an attractive young brunette Jim met through a mutual friend at a pool party at his home around 1986. Janie was a travel agent in Nashville at the time and from Huntington, Indiana. She actually had no idea who Ernest was when they met. As their conversations progressed, Jim told her he worked for a dairy company. In a sense, it was true, since a good portion of the money from the dairy clients made its way into his pockets. She was thinking that maybe he drove a dairy truck. She found out the truth and the jig was up. The two began dating, and soon she was handling many of his day-to-day business affairs as well as taking on the role of his biggest fan. I'm going to wet my whistle. There's a lot of folks here. On June 11th, 1988, Jim married Janie at his home in White House, Tennessee. I was 15 at the time and videotaped the ceremony and much of the reception and other happenings that followed. It was a beautiful sunny Saturday afternoon, providing a picturesque setting as friends and family gathered in a ceremony on the back of the property. Among the many friends of Jim's in attendance were Jim and John Hager, known as the Hager twins. Identical twin brothers were a country music and comedy duo who gained fame on Hee Haw. A federal judge officiated. Jim's good friend Buck Finley served as best man. Janie's sister Sharon was matron of honor. Jim's niece Andrea maid of honor. During the ceremony, the judge mentioned how unusual it was that he was performing a wedding ceremony because federal judges, unlike lower court judges, didn't have that authority by law. For this occasion, the General Assembly of Tennessee had to grant the authority. The judge said the founding fathers, in their infinite wisdom, did not wish to make marriage a federal offense. He then added to laughter, "Jim Varney getting married does rise to such a level." As friends and family posed for pictures after the ceremony, the young daughter of one of the guests began to cry after being placed beside Jim. Jim looked at the photographer and said, "We're abusing this child." It was his kickoff. Oh my God, there's a ladybug on my forehead. At the reception, Jim couldn't resist making faces as guests took pictures of him and Janie holding the knife beside the cake as Janie proceeded to slice into it. He yelled as if he was cutting into his flesh. Jim's mother couldn't help but laugh while futilely attempting to convey to Jim's seriousness of the occasion. A small group remained at the house after the reception. Finley brought out 2 guitars and announced that he and Jim were going to play a couple songs they had been working on. Both can be best classified as Southern rock. In the love song, "Tonight We Own the Moon," Jim overpowered Finley's voice, and in the upbeat anthem, "Time Waits for No One," Jim smacked his thigh and nearly sprang up from the couch as he reached for the notes. Just when things were finally winding down, Jim decided to give everyone a demonstration on the effectiveness of his bulletproof vest. Everyone followed him outside. He placed the vest on the ground near the house, went back up to the deck, drew a handgun, and fired into the vest. He then retrieved the vest and showed everyone where the bullet had hit, going into detail about the properties of Kevlar fiber. For guests hoping that the wedding would reflect Jim's personality, the event did not disappoint. All right, well that's the end anyhow. So, like I said, this is going to be a short one. But I do appreciate you for stopping by. It's going to be a lot longer on the next one. Next week, we got a song coming out. So phase 4 starts next week. I'm working on a song right now. It'll be ready. It'll be ready by Thursday. So next Thursday's